Brian Fargo had gone through high school playing games on his Apple II. But after graduating, he decided that he could probably make better games than the ones he was buying. So in 1982, he programmed the Demon's Forge using the company name Saber Software. He was all on his own, so in order to sell it, he spent half his budget on one single ad in the computer magazine Soft Talk. Then, to get retailers to want it, he would call up stores pretending to be a random gamer who wanted to play the cool game they'd seen in Soft Talk. The trick worked, and retailers started ordering the game from Saber Software, not knowing Saber was one person, and that it was the same one person who'd called them in the first place. The game got him the attention of Boone Corporation, where he went to work for the next year. But after one of Boone's board meetings ended in a fistfight, Fargo decided it was time to strike out on his own again. So he gathered together some friends and founded his own company in 1983. They went ahead with no real plan, having no idea that they were about to experience one of the most dramatic rises and precipitous falls in the history of their industry, going from small developer to top-level publisher to bankrupt, while at the same time giving major developers like Blizzard, BioWare, and Treyarch their start. Sit back and enjoy this bard's tale of Interplay Entertainment. In the early days, Interplay didn't do anything too exciting. They ported already existing games to other platforms and even did some work for a military subcontractor. Finally, they landed a deal with Activision to do some original games. Their first product was Mind Shadow in 1984, an adventure title based loosely on the novel The Bourne Identity by Robert Ludlum. The game, which required players to piece together their forgotten past, was a modest success and was a good start for Interplay as an original developer. And only a year later, Interplay produced its first major hit. Tales of the Unknown Volume 1, The Bard's Tale, was a role-playing game heavily inspired by the Wizardry series, which themselves perfectly utilized the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, albeit without an official license to do so. The Bard's Tale was much more sophisticated, adding in color, sound effects, and music to make the D&D experience that much more immersive. While the story was pretty bare bones, its famous intro sequence featured a bard recounting a tale that the gamers would then play through. And like Wizardry before it, the Bard's Tale featured an addicting blend of gathering loot and leveling up. Additionally, the game was expertly marketed by their new publisher, a young upstart called Electronic Arts. When all this was said and done, the Bard's Tale sold 300,000 copies, incredible for 1985. It turned Interplay from a no-name developer into a major industry player. The Tales of the Unknown was always meant to be a series, but the game's success had come with an unexpected problem. Everybody just called it Bard's Tale. Interplay had wanted to follow the game up with the Archmage's Tale and Thief's Tale. But now EA told Interplay that their sequels would have to be known as Bard's Tale 2 and 3, even though that had never been their intention. Still, EA proved it knew what it was doing as the later Bard's Tales games went on to be successes in their own right. Interplay was on a roll now, and like most developers of the late 80s, were putting out several games a year. 1988 saw the third Bard's Tale and Neuromancer, based on the famous cyberpunk novel by William Gibson. But the biggest Interplay game of '88 was Wasteland. A morally ambiguous post-apocalyptic RPG set in the southwestern United States, it was unlike any other game of the time. It featured a gigantic world that the player could explore as he willed, instead of being a linear experience. It had a rich storyline and a large cast of characters. Dungeons wouldn't reset every time you visited, and it would remember each enemy you killed or puzzle you solved. But most importantly, the game wasn't split into simple good and evil, like every other RPG. Choices were varying shades of gray, and sometimes players would find themselves in darker situations than other games dared go. It was another big success for Interplay, but it was still published by EA. But by 1988, the developer had decided that they didn't want anybody else telling them what to do anymore. Only 5 short years after their founding, Interplay decided to self-publish. So all on their own, they released Battle Chess, which was just chess, but with the one thing that every other chess game was missing: violence. Instead of simply capturing an opponent's piece, the fully realized sprites would duke it out for control of their square. It might not seem like much, but it grabbed audiences' attention and became a seller for Interplay. So as the 80s turned into the 90s, Interplay seemed to be sitting on top of the world. Brian Fargo and his team had grown the company into an RPG powerhouse that could successfully self-publish. There was only one last frontier to conquer: publishing games from other developers. That was, after all, where all the real money was, as they'd learned from watching Activision and EA take a chunk of their own games' profits. Now it was their turn, and they went for broke. Since the gaming industry was still relatively young, Interplay decided to gamble on a number of unestablished but talented young teams. One of the first was a group of 3 college grads calling themselves Silicon and Synapse. In 1991, Interplay published RPM Racing, which was the first American-made game for the Super Nintendo. This was a big deal for Interplay, since to date they'd only seen major successes on PCs. If they could make that jump to consoles, they'd be one of the biggest powers in the industry. Over the years, Silicon and Synapse would create a number of console products such as The Lost Vikings and Rock 'n' Roll Racing. Eventually, Interplay offered to acquire the little company outright. Sadly, the guys, now named Blizzard Entertainment, chose to go elsewhere. Interplay wouldn't know how much they'd lost until later. In the meantime, Interplay was still doing great work as a developer. In 1992, they obtained the license to do a game based on the original Star Trek series. This wasn't considered that big a deal. The show had been off the air for decades, and the follow-up series, The Next Generation, was what all the kids were watching now. But in terms of both commercial sales and critical praise, Star Trek 25th Anniversary ended up being the first successful Star Trek video game. For a later CD-ROM version, Interplay even reunited the original cast to the show to do the voices. Not too bad for a couple of video game nerds. Throughout the 90s, they continued their trend of giving talented young companies their start. In 1995, they published Descent by Parallax Software. Descent was considered a Doom clone at the time, though in fact it was more of a successor to the games that inspired Doom, like Wing Commander. With full 6-axis controls, engaging graphics, and addicting multiplayer, Descent became an underground hit. Parallax later split into Outrage and Volition continued to publish through Interplay for several years. The games of their Free Space series are considered some of the finest space sims ever produced. Then in 1996, Interplay published a pair of mech games that never really caught on. Max was produced internally as the company's first entry into the strategy genre. This genre had suddenly become popular after the release of Westwood Studios' Command & Conquer. Max was similar in many ways, except that it was turn-based instead of real-time. That said, it garnered very positive reviews, with many critics stating that Max was actually better than Command & Conquer. Unfortunately, gamers didn't feel the same way, and the product didn't sell very well. That same year, Interplay released the mech combat game Shattered Steel, but it, too, never really got off the ground. Maybe that's not so surprising, since it was the first game from a couple of med students with no background in entertainment. Nevertheless, Interplay stayed on good terms with the guys who called themselves BioWare. Little did they know, this group of doctors in Canada would end up being their most important relationship. But in 1997, Interplay had their sights on another company that they hoped would push them into the top echelon of publishers. Shiny Entertainment had attained global success with their Earthworm Jim games, which had spun off into toys, t-shirts, and a Saturday morning cartoon show. They were currently at work on their next franchise, MDK, and the hype behind it was at fever pitch. It was a surefire hit if there ever was one. So Interplay didn't just sign the publishing rights, they bought the whole company. So after years of buzz and massive press attention, MDK finally released, to only middling sales. While it wasn't a flop, it was a disappointment. Later, Interplay would once again try to dominate the console space with Shiny's Wild 9, but this game, again, disappointed. So it seemed that Interplay was consigned to the PC, even though more and more dollars were moving away from that platform and towards consoles. But even amidst the bad news, Interplay still had a few titles to write home about. Carmageddon from Stainless Games was a wild racing game that threw acceptability to the wind. Players gained points for running over pedestrians and destroying enemy cars, and featured a loose interpretation of the laws of physics. But gamers loved it. 1997 had one other major game of note, a throwback to their old Wasteland series. EA still held the rights to that franchise, so Interplay built a new one from the ground up. The result was Fallout. Like Wasteland, it was a post-apocalyptic RPG that eschewed traditional morality. Once again, the player was faced with some grim decisions with no upside, but with a sense of arid, dry humor that somehow made it all hysterical. The art design was a throwback to 1950s pulp fiction, with robots, ray guns, and cathode ray tubes. The world was open for the player to explore, the level-up system was deep and accessible, and the characters were memorable. It also had an astounding voice cast for games of the era, including Richard Dean Anderson, Keith David, Tony Shalhoub, and Ron Perlman as the narrator. Like Wasteland before it, it was a sensation with audiences. And yet, in terms of sales, it couldn't compete with console juggernauts like Final Fantasy VII. It was like no matter how hard they tried and how well they were reviewed, they just couldn't sell like their competitors. And now, the cracks were starting to show. By this time, Interplay was a monster, publishing roughly as many games as Activision or EA. That's an extremely expensive business, but Interplay lacked the sales to justify it. Successful PC games just weren't matching successful console games in terms of revenue. If Interplay couldn't find a console hit soon, or at least get more games to turn a profit, they'd be in serious trouble. They had no idea how bad it was about to get. Tune in next time to watch the fall of a gaming great.